Rome was the largest empire, the mightiest military force, the greatest civilization on Earth. But most of all, it was a place. This city. Though only traces remain and most of its ruins lie buried beneath modern streets, here in stone is the story of the ancient Romans. Using new finds and new thinking, the fragments are now being pieced back together. These people took a swamp and drained it. They perfected concrete, the most versatile construction material on Earth, and they quarried millions of tons of marble. They used it all to build the imperial capital. Centuries of innovation, endurance, and ambition. This is the story of the greatest city on Earth. For sheer scale, there was nothing like the Roman Empire. It wasn't merely the land it covered. At its peak, 3 continents, 2 million square miles. It wasn't the number of people it ruled, 60 million. Almost a third of the global population. It was the time it lasted, the fact that it spanned centuries.
When we think of Rome, of the Roman emperors, the Romans themselves viewed their city already as ancient. Over 500 years of construction, destruction, and reconstruction had shaped the city.
They worshipped this city as Roma, a goddess, and her history was sacred. It's impossible to understand the Caesars or the grand capital they built for themselves without understanding just how it all began.
Tradition has it that Rome was founded here, on the Palatine Hill, one of Rome's oldest hills, and it's right here that we have the remains of a hut that dates back to the 8th century BC.
There was a widely held belief that the city's founding fathers were Romulus and Remus, the semi-divine sons of the god Mars. And the myth must have made sense. After all, Rome's earliest times saw a piece of engineering work that was almost superhuman in scale. Without it, there could be no city here.
This is the Roman Forum. It's the commercial center of Rome. It's the political center. It's the religious center. It is the heart of the empire that spans the Mediterranean. Originally, it didn't look like this, though. Originally, it's wet, uninhabitable.
The tribal homeland of the Romans was a swamp, a breeding ground for disease, particularly malaria. No settlement could thrive on this land unless a vast area was drained.
Rome didn't grow into an imperial world city because of its natural advantages. It was the Romans that made Rome, and not the location.
Major construction begins around 600 BC. An army of laborers cuts these channels. At first, they are just open drains, collecting the water that runs off the hills. Later, they're covered over and built on. These tunnels are so well made and so robust that even today some are still in use.
The way they go about making these kinds of drains is they start with the bedrock. So the lower courses, the lowermost courses, they're actually cutting right through the bedrock, the tuff of the hill of the Capitoline. Then on top of that, they take other blocks and they stack them up to make these walls.
It's only in the last 2 years that these drains have been properly explored. Archaeologist Cristiano Ranieri came here in 2008. He's undertaken the task of mapping all the tunnels in the network. On every corner, in every crack, he makes a new archaeological find.
Cristiano's examining this material, amphorae, ceramics, bones, and it just accumulates over time as people continue to dump the debris into the channels. This material documents the life of ancient Rome.
Chances are the last person to see these fragments was the Roman who discarded them 2,000 years ago. But the most remarkable discovery is still the network itself. Its sheer scale and ambition. Ranieri's work shows that there are more than 15 miles of tunnels. As a feat of construction, it rivals any of the buildings above. And it marks a key moment. The beginning of Rome's march from tribal settlement to imperial city.
Without structures like this, we wouldn't have the Forum becoming the grand space it was for commercial activities, for socializing. We wouldn't have Rome.
In the 2,500 years since the people of Rome reclaimed this land, their city has never stopped evolving. Today, civil engineers are cutting their own tunnels. They're building a new subway line, and their work regularly turns up pieces of the past.
The amazing thing about being in the city of Rome is that there's always something new to discover. You can dig anywhere in this city, and you just don't know what you're going to find.
These ruins were found on the planned site of a subway exit. In its time, this was a key government building, with a major role in shaping the city. This piece of stone hung on its exterior.
The name is Fabius Felix Pacificus Paulinus Vir Clarissimus et Illustris Prefectus Urbis Studii Suis. This discovery is very important, maybe to understand the function of the imperial building.
This was a public building dedicated to the Prefectus Urbis. He is the closest thing Rome has to a mayor. This office supervises the flow of grain and keeps the people fed. It controls the urban cohorts, the police forces which keep order. It maintains the roads and the drains and the water supply, but in particular the prefect's office oversees planning and building. It dates back to the early days of the Roman Republic. And from the beginning, its holders have tried to forge order from chaos, to manage and map a city that changes with every passing year.
Sometimes we tend to compress it and imagine the Colosseum was always there, and these, grand imperial Rome was always there. Ancient Rome was not one place. Ancient Rome lasted a long, long time.
Construction becomes a political tool, as great men vie to show their power and their generosity. They build in the name of Rome, and using the spoils of war.
One of the fundamental spurs to building is personal glory. Personal glory is completely and totally tied up with the power of Rome. The way that you are remembered is through your name remaining on people's lips and your monument being permanent.
There comes a time when the skyline of Rome is crowded with temples and monuments. The theatre of Pompey, the Forum of Caesar. But then in 27 BC, there is a seismic shift. Rome has been evolving, but this is a revolution. The first emperor is crowned. His name is Augustus. He is the adopted son of Julius Caesar. For nearly 20 years he's fought for control. He's eliminated all his rivals, and now from his base on the Palatine Hill, he sets about gathering all power for himself.
This is the house of Augustus, and it was here, within these walls, more than 2,000 years ago, that Augustus redesigned Rome and made this a command center for his empire.
He now has the vast resources of the empire at his disposal. The ingenuity and efficiency of the most advanced civilization on Earth are now concentrated in the hands of one man. Now, Rome is entering a golden age, and from it will come some of the most extraordinary feats of construction the world has ever seen.
In the 200 years between the 2nd century BC and the reign of Augustus, Rome's population quadrupled. The city was thriving, but there became a new issue: waste.
Since the earliest times, the Romans have gone to their river, the Tiber, for clean water. Unfortunately, all their drains also flow into the Tiber. The river has been poisoned.
The Tiber River was choked with garbage, human waste, even bodies. You wouldn't want to drink out of the Tiber River anymore.
So it begins, one of the ancient world's greatest construction projects. Not a tomb, or a temple, or a monument, but an undertaking of clear, practical necessity. Rome's engineers will find other sources of water in the hills outside the city, and they will bring it above the rooftops to fill fountains, pools, and baths. They'll build aqueducts. The Aqua Claudia is at least 40 miles long. From end to end, it drops at an average rate of just 1 foot in every 400. And while today these great arches symbolize the genius of Roman building, they are almost the easy part of the job. For every mile of aqueduct in the air, there are 6 miles buried in the ground. Duncan Keenan Jones has followed the Aqua Claudia all the way back to its source. It's high in the Apennine Hills, 30 miles east of Rome.
This location here gives us a really good idea of how they constructed these underground aqueduct tunnels. If we look here, we can see the pick marks of one team moving in this direction, team of workers digging up the rock. And this here is the exact point where the two teams met, another team coming from this direction. We can see the change in the height of the tunnel here, as this team was obviously digging the roof a bit higher than the other team, so they haven't quite met there. If we look on the wall here, we can see where the deposits formed by the water reach. It's only halfway up the channel here.
The tunnel is the minimum height necessary to swing a pickaxe. And work down here was clearly a difficult, claustrophobic business. Every inch forward takes the tunnellers further away from the light. And the men have only a single naked flame to work by. There are small recesses in the walls to hold their lamps. Once the tunnelling is finished, it takes constant work to keep the water flowing.
This is the remains of the original lining of the channel. We can see here that this thin layer on top of the mortar is a build-up of limestone, like scale in your kettle, or like stalactites and stalagmites in caves. Even this small amount here could reduce the amount of water getting to Rome by half, so it required continual maintenance to chip out this deposit and make sure that as much water as possible reached Rome.
Some of the tunnels are still in use. This is the fascination for Dr. Leo Lombardi, who's devoted a lifetime to studying them.
We are in the best preserved of all the Roman aqueducts here in Rome. It's been working continuously for 2,000 years, since 19 years before Christ, and it still brings water into the city.
It's still here because the Romans invested so much in their aqueducts. Their time, their money, their skill, their stone, their ingenuity, and their pride.
Aqueduct building was part of a whole social system and should be understood in the context of social life and political life in Rome. The average Roman citizen would come into contact with this water when the water of the aqueducts was piped to basins almost on every street corner, so there would be a neighborhood fountain.
An aqueduct is a living monument. Every time a man takes a drink or visits the public baths, he is reminded of the man who built it.
They get credit, their presence was advertised by these fantastic projects, almost magically delivering water into town in abundance, keep the crowd happy, because that was part of the whole equation in Rome. You know, bread and circuses, could be bread circuses and baths, should be really part of that.
A resident of modern London might expect to consume between 40 and 60 gallons of water a day. By some estimates, in the early 3rd century, every person in ancient Rome has access to nearly 300 gallons. And with this supply in place, a major barrier to growth is removed. Given Rome's vast, expanding trade network, every other commodity can be bought and brought in. And under Augustus, Rome looks more and more like a modern city. It has suburbs and slums, houses and tenements, public spaces and back streets. Augustus gives Rome its first police force and its first public fire department.
Augustus's contributions were immense. He improved the hygiene with the aqueducts and the drainage, but they also built these great spaces like the Imperial Fora.
The Fora are the heart of Rome. These great spaces are where the public life of the city plays out. Politics, the law, trade, entertainment. And here, written in stone, is the story of Rome's metamorphosis into a caput mundi, head of the world. The old Forum, the Forum of the Republic, is a jumble of temples and paths and statues. But next to it, Augustus builds something very different. Rows of regimented columns, clean lines laid out in a disciplined grid. They are built to intimidate. This is a place from which Rome can rule the world.
Augustus began that project of providing the Romans specific space to be Romans.
Naturally, it is known as the Forum of Augustus. These towering ruins are just a shadow of what once stood here. There's none of the chaos of the old Forum. It is one complex dominated by a massive temple to Mars Ultor. Mars, the Avenger.
Augustus promises Mars Ultor that if Mars Ultor allows him to avenge the death of his father Julius Caesar, Augustus will build the god a lavish temple. And of course it has to be the most lavish temple that Rome has ever seen.
The sacred promise is Augustus's justification for seizing all the land in this area.
This is what remains of the temple of Mars the Avenger. It's the reason for Augustus's Forum. Now, to build all this, an entire neighbourhood, an upmarket one too, had to be swept away, and the road network of central Rome had to be diverted round it. And not surprisingly, it took 40 years to build.
But Augustus knows what he's doing. He knows that long after his vow is forgotten, the temple will stand as his own monument.
What began as a symbol of personal vengeance ended as a monument to the peace acquired through conquest.
The site of Augustus's Forum is littered with pieces of finely worked marble. It covers every surface here, and its choice is very deliberate. White marble indicates purity, endurance, refinement. It is as potent a sign of the emperor's position as his purple robe or his oak leaf crown. Only he has the wealth to use marble on such a scale. Rome's white marble came from the mountains of Carrara, 200 miles to the north. The ancient Romans were the first to quarry on a large scale here, and the work has barely stopped since.
That's Julius Caesar who begins quarrying marble here in Carrara, but it's not until Augustus that the pace really quickens, as the emperor decides to transform the city of brick into the city of marbles.
In the 21st century, 1.5 million tons of marble are quarried from Carrara every year. Back in the 1st century, without modern transport or technology, it is down to manpower. The quarries of Augustus are run like a military operation.
At the height of empire, as many as 27,000 men, and that's the equivalent of 4 to 5 legions, were employed in quarries throughout the empire. These are actual Roman tools found in this very quarry. The larger pick heads would have been used to gouge channels in the quarry face itself, but these smaller ones were used for roughing out the block, a process that concluded the extraction. A special group of quarrymen called the quadratarii would basically square the block, removing the excess stone and making the blocks lighter for travel.
Once the blocks are prepared, the Romans faced the task of getting them a mile down the mountain, and then transported the 200 miles back to Rome.
After extraction, the blocks would be loaded onto wooden sleds, and they'd be lowered very, very slowly down the mountain on sled runs made from compacted rubble and detritus from the quarry. Once they reached the valley, they'd be loaded onto carts drawn by teams of oxen who would drag them all the way to the coastline a few short miles behind me.
Brilliant white Carrara marble becomes the face of Imperial Rome. But when he builds his forum, Augustus goes further. He dresses it with materials transported from all over the empire. To anyone who knows how to look, every slab is a statement. It is a catalogue of victories.
We're now standing in the Aula del Colosso, the room of the Colossus. And if you look at the checkerboard floor below my feet, you'll see 2 of these different kinds of marbles. We have this yellow, golden-hued marble from North Africa, and this white, purple-streaked marble from Western Turkey. Now, these were luxury goods. To walk across them was almost like walking across gold. But they also were able to, in some sense, conjure up a mineral map of empire. And they summoned up the resources necessary to bring the provinces to the capital, literally by the power to move mountains.
As a piece of propaganda, this is a stroke of genius. Any citizen entering the forum is bound to be awestruck by what Augustus has done. But he is also invited to be part of it, to feel himself to be one of the rulers of the world. He is treading the spoils of foreign wars beneath his own feet. He is being told that just by being Roman, he has elite status. Augustus is saying, not I rule, but we rule.
Augustus was a master propagandist, so he played this really delicate, intriguing game of showing Romans power at the same time as trying to suggest he is not going to offend their sensibilities and make it so obvious that they're being dominated by one of their own.
And yet, of course, he does dominate. He'd politicked, battled, and murdered his way to power. He reigned for 41 years. By the time of his death, most people can remember no other ruler. He is present in every aspect of their lives, And here, at the center of it all, he literally looms over them.
The 6 times life-size Colossus that once stood on the podium behind me. This probably represented the Genius Augusti, that is, the life force of the emperor. It was made from the finest grade and the most dazzlingly white Greek marble. And looking at this luminous phantom was like looking at the soul of the emperor who inaugurated the City of Marble.
Augustus's City of Marble shone, a beacon of Roman power. But despite all of his fabulous building projects, much of his Rome is still constructed from wood. Fires are frequent and deadly, and soon a large section of the city will be all but destroyed.
Time and time again through Rome's history, fires break out. They break out frequently because so much of Rome, the residential quarters, are high-rises made largely of wood, and the fire can spread quickly through the narrow streets. But there is an important byproduct to this destruction. It allows many emperors the opportunity to rebuild the city and to leave their mark.
As many as 100 fires break out every day. Most are contained, but some are catastrophic. The worst comes in the summer of 64 AD. It burns for a week, destroys 70% of the city's neighborhoods, and leaves Rome a smoldering wreck. The emperor at the time is Nero. Later people will say he's insane. They'll say he started the fire himself, offloading the blame onto Rome's Christian community so that he could build the city of his dreams. But looking at the evidence today, scholars see something different. Nero leads a rapid, measured reaction to the crisis.
He or his advisors certainly had a pragmatic response to what was a national disaster.
With the fires out and thousands of people left homeless, they have to start again. It has to be done quickly and cheaply, and that means rethinking the way that Rome makes its buildings. They turn to what is then a relatively new experimental technology, one to which only the Romans have access.
All throughout the Mediterranean, people have been using mortar for a long time. It's a kind of gluey substance composed of lime, sand, and water. But the Romans come along and do something a little bit different. They add an aggregate, and this creates concrete, and that is extraordinary. It's probably the most important contribution the Romans make to the field of architecture.
Mortar holds building blocks together, but add crushed stone, and it becomes a construction material in its own right. When the Romans first mixed concrete, it was an act of genius, but they also got lucky.
Normally, mortar would be made with ordinary sand. The city of Rome doesn't have much ordinary sand, it's all volcanic.
Put volcanic sand into the mix, and it produces a very particular reaction.
It has very unique reactive capabilities with hydrated lime, and in addition, it forms very durable pozzolanic cements. This is really the secret of Roman concrete.
Put simply, using this ingredient makes for top quality concrete.
And so by accident, really, they used this ingredient which gave them a faster setting and incredibly strong and totally superior material.
Most importantly, it doesn't have to be brought from a quarry. The rubble left by the fire can be recycled.
The Great Fire must have created a vast amount of debris, which had to be cleared away. And of course, concrete is an ideal material for making use of that debris. Is of course you can put a lot of that rubble into the concrete core.
Well, here we're looking at the wall nucleus, or core of the concrete structure. The actual facing is the chunks of tuff that form this sort of slightly lumpy surface. The ancient Roman builders made an exterior facing for the walls. Then they filled the interior with concrete.
This was the basic method, pouring the mix between two faces of brick or stone. But soon the Romans see that by using timber in a technique called shuttering, they could make molds in virtually any shape. The Great Fire is followed by a period of bold experimentation. And the Romans get so good at this that the methods hardly changed to this day.
You can see there's still no substitute for timber for certain jobs. The principle of building a concrete fort remains the same. The formwork of shuttering is packed with a slurry of mortar and aggregate, allowed to set. Once it's set, the props are knocked away, the shuttering is removed, and a new fort is built.
Nero's engineers see that this way of working has endless possibilities. They begin working on a new imperial palace. Without concrete, its design would be unthinkable.
A great loss from Rome's skyline is Nero's most innovative architectural construction. The Domus Aurea, or Golden House of Nero, lies beneath the Baths of Trajan, and at the center of this complex was an octagonal hall made of revolutionary concrete vaulting.
You would not know you were in a concrete room. Rather than having a structure which has to have massive walls to support it, you can begin to see the Roman architects and engineers paring away at the structure. They're turning things that look like the tents of the Persian kings, which are ephemeral, and making them permanent.
The way we remember Nero is determined by the manner of his death. He kills himself in 68 AD as a palace coup pushes him from power. A year of civil war follows, and the new dynasty which emerges plans to erase all his monuments. The Domus Aurea is systematically stripped, filled with earth and built upon. It lies forgotten for 1400 years. Its gardens become the site of the new arena, the Colosseum, and Nero himself becomes little more than a despised memory. And yet what he's achieved can't be ignored. He's championed a new way of building, one that is as radical in its time as the construction of the first skyscrapers. Buildings with arches and vaulted ceilings appear all over the city. Concrete is so versatile, strong and cheap that engineers can work on a grander scale than ever seen before. And this is Nero's legacy. His work lays the ground for one of the greatest of all Roman buildings, the Pantheon. In 125 AD, as the empire reaches its peak, a high point in terms of culture, political power, and technology, the Emperor Hadrian builds one of Rome's greatest monuments.
Here we are in the Pantheon, the greatest of all Roman domes. It's the culmination of their building technology using unreinforced concrete, and the whole space measures 150 foot wide and it's 150 foot tall. So it's a fantastic spatial experience.
The Pantheon is a mystery. That's its attraction. You cannot classify it. It doesn't look like anything you've ever seen. You go into it and the space is a rush that sweeps you up into it, and that's its fascination.
This building has been in continuous use for 1900 years, 1,400 of them as a Catholic church. But the reason for its original construction, the reason why engineers without access to cranes or steel could even think of raising a dome which weighs 5,000 tons, is unclear.
One of the mysteries of the Pantheon is what it was used for. We don't know if it was a shrine for all the gods, as is suggested by its name. We do know that Hadrian held court in the Pantheon, and I always think that it's a wonderful emblem of him, because I see him in the center of the Pantheon, but he is the spotlighted one, and he's the one who's giving the decisions. And so the building contributed to the force of the decisions that the emperor was making.
Its design is a work of genius.
This 150-foot space is held up by a 20-foot thick drum. Inside there are actual hidden voids right the way within the structure, like a honeycomb, and they are lightening the structure.
Putting up a structure like this is about balancing strength and weight. The walls of the drum need to be 20 feet thick, but the danger is that when the dome is placed on top, the combined weight will cause a collapse. The builders lighten the walls by making voids inside them, and when it comes to the dome, they use all their ingenuity. By this point in Rome's history, its engineers have been experimenting with concrete for more than 300 years. They know how to alter its mix so the higher it is, the lighter the load will get.
We start from solid travertine aggregate, which is the heavy and compact material, working up through tough brick and finally pumice. So right at the top we have the lightest of all possible material, lighter than water, and then finally the oculus, which is actually, of course, pure air.
The key to its stability is a ring of stone at the dome's highest point. It's the focus of all the weight. Each section of the vaulting is pushing on this ring, and the equal forces on all sides cancel each other out. It's a neat, practical solution, but it also creates a tremendous visual effect. On a clear day, the sun shines like a spotlight into the space below.
The oculus of the Pantheon could be said to just be an engineering necessity. But the oculus also is very much in fitting with the use of the Pantheon as a place for the emperor to give judgment. Romans believed that the gods should see when they were making judgment, that they should be doing it in the open air. And so the oculus allows, if you will, all the gods to look in and know what is going on in the Pantheon.
And yet it still holds its secrets. Today, visitors can be so keen to see inside the Pantheon that they forget the building's exterior.
The feat of building the dome is matched out here in the portico by another constructional enterprise of almost equal magnificence.
To Mark Wilson-Jones, it's only by looking closely at this part of the structure, its vast columned entrances, that you really understand what the Pantheon means.
Here we have 16 sumptuous Corinthian columns, but it's when we look at the shafts that we see something really astounding. They're 5 foot wide, 40 foot tall. That means 50 tons each. But when we look at the details of this part of the building, there are some singular features that lead us to believe that the Roman building machine may have hit its uppermost limits.
He sees signs that the builders had reached as far as they could go. This may be the greatest building, made by the greatest engineers, of the greatest empire in the ancient world. Wilson-Jones sees both Rome's peak and perhaps the beginning of its decline. From these extraordinary heights, there is only one way: down. In the 2nd century AD, under the Emperor Hadrian, the Roman Empire covers more land, rules more people, and enjoys more wealth than ever before. This is the climate in which the Pantheon is built, the extraordinary product of an extraordinary time. It's a cylindrical chamber, the height of a 7-story office block, topped on what is still the largest unsupported concrete dome anywhere in the world. At its front, the rectangular portico, 16 columns, each one 40 feet tall and carved from a single piece of Egyptian granite weighing over 80 tons. It's tempting to see the Pantheon as an expression of Roman dominance. Its unchallenged mastery of the ancient world. The problem is, this building is not perfect.
This is the Pantheon. It's one of the most impressive things that the Romans built from the ancient world, and it's one of the best preserved monuments from antiquity. But take a look at the portico up there. Above it is the start of another one, and that doesn't make any sense.
It's the point where the column's rectangular entrance meets the drum of the main building. Above the line of the V-shaped roof, there's another joint. It's as if they intended to build the entrance even higher, but then thought better of it.
Lots of people have been trying to get an explanation for this phenomenon. It's puzzled architects since the 15th century. It's a strange puzzle, but it seems to have been begun all as part of one unified project, and then presumably something went wrong.
Has ancient Roman technology finally hit its limit? After centuries of improvement and innovation, has the builder's ambition outstripped their ability? This building was the product of a massive operation. The columns shipped all the way from Alexandria. And here Mark Wilson Jones believes he spotted the weak link.
Now, that's a long sea voyage. We know that there's plenty of shipwrecks with columns, in fact, at the bottom of the Mediterranean. This is the kind of scenario that we could expect.
He believes that Hadrian's architects were faced with a difficult choice.
And then what would happen? I think the instruction must have come down from on high that the building needs to be completed, even if they have to have second best and make recourse to a set of 40-foot shafts that they could divert from another project.
Using this theory as a basis, it is possible now to reconstruct the Pantheon, Rome's greatest building, as it was originally planned.
Then the design, magically everything rises up. The main portico would have been as high as the second pediment. So then, instead of this rather enigmatic building, we would have a much more perfect, unified project.
Instead, they made a practical, pragmatic choice, and this is the building that we have today. What the men who built the Pantheon could not possibly have known is that this is a one-off. In them, at that moment, Rome had some of the best engineers in the history of the ancient world. It would never again come this close to perfection.
This is Roman construction near the apogee of its powers. They certainly couldn't have done it 100 years later, that's for sure.
The Roman Empire had another 3 centuries of life left. But this was its high point, and what followed was decline. Slowly, they forgot how to build like this.
When the empire is at its peak, the level of building, both its complexity and simply just the frequency of it, means that there's always somebody to train. When the empire gets itself into political, financial difficulties, the amount of building decreases. And if the amount of building decreases, the need for skilled workmen decreases. It's easy to see then how some skills can be lost.
The city had grown because the empire expanded. It was run by men who demanded more and better and paid for it with conquest. When the power of the empire faded, so did the city. There came a time when the glories of Rome were just a memory. Its organization, its technology, its ability to build were gone too. When this wall is constructed, the Pantheon is already 800 years old.
Doesn't look like anything special. You probably hardly notice it. But take a look at the holes. These give us clues as to what was lost to the engineering world when ancient Rome collapsed. Now, the structure itself is made in the 9th century AD, but take a look at that brickwork. It's made of reused bricks from antiquity, bits and pieces that are placed in undulating courses. Take a look at the holes for the scaffolding. It's very rough, and it gives an idea that when they're building the scaffolding out of wood, they're just taking tree branches and shoving them in. So this is a far cry from what the people were able to build when Rome was at its greatest, when Rome was at its peak.
After the empire, Rome shrank. From a peak population of over 1 million, it fell to barely 100,000. Many of the aqueducts dried up, and the buildings of the Forum fell into ruin. They were robbed of their marble. No one in Europe would build again on this scale until the coming of the Industrial Revolution.
In the 300-year period that really sees Rome at its height, there was a greater use of stone employed in construction than at any time thereafter or before until probably the early part of the 19th century.
What stands in the Forum today is the shadow of what was once there. A place built by engineers as good as any that have ever lived. We call it ancient Rome, but in fact, it was the first modern city.